Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we'll be taking a look at Rallycross. Now, as per usual, we're actually going to divide this episode up into 4 sections. The first part, we're going to be taking a look at the options available that are specific to Rallycross or useful in Rallycross. Then we're going to take a look at actually how Rallycross works inside Project Cars 2. Then we're going to take a look at the various different types of cars for Rallycross. And then finally, we're going to take a look at various driving techniques and tips for actually Rallycross racing. So starting off with the first part, taking a look at the options. In the main options under the gameplay screen, you got on-screen the guides and display tab, and then here you've got 2 options. You've got the race engineer and you've also got the spotter. Now the race engineer, obviously you've got the various options of off, authentic and always. The race engineer generally tends to give you generic information about your car and about your race. So it'll give you information about your tyre wear, your tyre temperatures, obviously give you warning if the engine's getting too hot, give you updates on your lap times, where you are in terms of position whilst out on track, and also give you motivational talk and encourage you throughout your race. The spotter works slightly differently, and if you've got it set to either authentic or always, the spotter will actually work inside the Rallycross modes. Now what the spotter will be doing is he'll tell you how close other cars are in proximity to yourself, so he'll give you information as to how many car lengths back the next car behind you is if he's starting to get close, whether he's 1 or 2 car lengths back or whether he's right up against your rear bumper. He'll also tell you if there's actually cars alongside you, and also when that space alongside you is clear, and he'll also tell you the best time to actually take the Joker lap as well. Now over on the authenticity tab, you need to be mindful of the actual driving assists. If you've got this set to authentic, you will actually have no assists on the Rallycross cars, as generally it's a lot easier to drive the cars without assists. Obviously for those who are very inexperienced with actually driving cars in general, it may actually be beneficial to have the traction control and anti-lock brakes assists on, but generally for those who are able to drive and have done a fair bit of driving and actually want to get into Rallycross, the best way is to have it on either authentic or have all the assists turned off. Now if you want, you can have the anti-lock brakes set to on. However, if you're going to be doing ice racing, it's better to have it actually to have the anti-lock brakes off. But stability control and traction control you'll definitely want to have turned off, as these will actually hinder you when trying to slide through corners using the handbrake. It restricts the amount of power and it makes driving around the circuit a little bit more difficult and actually slows you down. The final option that you'll need to pay attention to is over in the controls section under the edit assignments tab, and then under motion you'll need to add a key or button assignment to the handbrake. Generally it's very useful to have the handbrake in Rallycross, as you may find that there's times when you need to quickly yank the handbrake to help rotate the car around through a corner just that little bit better. Other than that, you should be pretty good in terms of options. So now we're actually going to take a look at how Rallycross actually works inside Project Cars 2, which will work in one of 2 ways depending on which game mode that you're actually in. If you're in career, then you will get the full Rallycross experience, and what I mean by that is that you'll be competing against 17 other drivers in each round. Obviously with you that's 18 in total, and then each round is divided into 4 qualifying heats, semi-final and then a final race. There is a 30-minute practice session which you can do beforehand, but it is optional, so you can turn that off if you wish to not do it. The rest of the sessions in the round, however, are not optional and are set to a specific lap count. Each of the 4 qualifying heats are 4 laps in length, the semi-final is 6 laps, and then the final race is also 6 laps. In all of these 4 qualifying heats, the semi-final and the final, you'll compete against 5 other drivers. And the way this works is in a knockout structure. You'll compete in all 4 qualifying heats, and at the end of each qualifying heat you'll be given points depending on your finishing position. At the end of the 4th qualifying heat, all these points will be totaled up, and then the top 12 drivers will advance onto the semi-finals. Separate to that though, the top 16 drivers will actually score championship points, and those points allocations can actually be seen on the screen now. You will then compete in one of the 2 semi-final races. If you finish in the top 3 of the semi-final race, you will advance onto the final. At this point, at the end of the semi-finals, you also actually earn more championship points towards the championship standings. Now when it comes to the actual final itself, It's the 6 drivers competing against each other for 6 laps, and then at the end of those 6 laps, the winner of the round will actually be determined. At this point, the finalists will be given points depending on their finishing positions, and those will count towards the overall championship standings. When it comes to the actual racing and the grid ordering for the qualifying sessions, the semi-final and the final, for the 4 qualifying sessions, all 6 drivers will be lined up alongside each other abreast across the start-finish line. In the first qualifying heat, the actual order of this lineup is completely randomised. However, for the second, third and fourth heat, these will be determined based on the fastest time from the previous qualifying heat. For the actual semi-final and also the final, cars will actually be formed in 3 rows of 2 drivers. And the order of this grid will actually be determined by the points scored from the qualifying heats for the semi-final, and then for the final, the points scored in the semi-final. Now, in every Rallycross race, you have to perform what will be known as a joker lap. This is an alternative route from the normal circuit, and you have to take it at least once per race. If you don't take it in a race, you'll get a penalty, but also if you take it more than once in a race, you can also get yourself with a penalty as well. Although contact is allowed in Rallycross, very heavy contact will also be penalised, so whilst a little bit of door rubbing and slight wheel banging is allowed, try not to hit your opponents too hard or spin them out, as you may run the risk of actually getting yourself a penalty. So that's the structure and regulations for career. For quick play with the custom race and online custom race doing online lobbies, things are much simpler. You simply do just the final race of what is essentially a Rallycross round. You don't have to do, there is no qualifying heats or semi-final. Essentially what you'll do is you'll compete against 5 other drivers on your Rallycross track in the Rallycross car. You have to do the joker lap still. If you don't serve the joker lap, or you serve the joker lap more than once, you'll still get a penalty. And likewise with contact, very heavy contact, you'll still get penalties there. But if we go into the custom race, for example, creating an online custom lobby works in the same way. If you go down into the motorsport presets, there is a Rallycross option here which will set up all the rules and tailor your custom event for Rallycross. So as you'll see here in the session settings, practice and qualifying is actually disabled, so you'll only be doing the actual final race itself. If you go into the race settings, you'll see that it'll be locked to 6 laps. You'll have the standing start type. Obviously there's no formation lap, as we only allow formation laps in the rolling start, and Rallycross races are always standing starts. And then there'll be no mandatory pit stop, because there is no pit stops in Rallycross racing. There's no actual weather progression because the races are only 6 laps. They're very short, you can't change that. However, you can set the date, the start time of the race, the time progression, and then also the weather that you actually want to run in your race. With the track selection, obviously using the Rallycross Motorsport preset, all the tracks will be filtered to actually Rallycross circuits. So this makes it a lot easier in actually choosing the Rallycross track that you actually want to compete in. And then likewise with the cars as well, it'll be filtered to just the cars that are applicable to Rallycross, and we'll get onto those in a minute. When it comes to the actual opponent settings, it'll be locked to racing against 5 other opponents. You can choose the actual opponent's skill and also the aggression. Obviously if you're racing online and you're not having AI and you're choosing to race against human opponents, obviously the skill level and opponent aggression won't matter. You're locked to the same class in terms of field opponent type, and then you can choose your grid position for your single player custom event. However, if you're racing online, the actual grid positions will be randomized, and you actually use a qualifying heat grid position as well. So you all start in a single line alongside each other abreast to make it as fair as possible when competing online, and the randomization of that grid order doesn't really matter all that much. For the next part of this episode, we're actually going to take a look at the cars that are available in the game for Rallycross racing. Now, if you really wanted to, you could disable that Rallycross Motorsport preset and take any car in Project Cars 2 and race it on a Rallycross track. For all cars in the game, there is what is known as an all-terrain tyre, which allows you to race on both tarmac and also loose surfaces such as mud, gravel or dirt. And then you've also got an ice tyre, which allows you to race on snow and ice tracks. All cars within the game will contain those 2 tyres, so if you really wanted to, you could take a touring car, a GT3 car, an LMP car, or even like a Formula A or Formula X and race it on a Rallycross track for some rather extreme fun, but we're actually going to focus on the cars that are specifically designed for Rallycross within the game. Now, going into the vehicle select and changing it to filter by classes, we have 3 classes here. Obviously, with DLC coming in the future, there may be a Rallycross based class that will come in a future pack and add to this, but for the moment, at the time of recording this video, there are just 3 classes that are included in the game. The first one is the Vintage RX class, which contains the Ford Escort RS 1600 Rallycross car. This is the same as the racing version, but it's just been adapted to actually Rallycross conditions, obviously with some updated suspension, and it features 190 horsepower with rear-wheel drive, and it's basically your proper old school Rallycross racing. Next up, we have the RX Lights class, which contains the Ahlström's MSE RX Supercar Light, and this is your perfect introduction to Rallycross racing. It's got 4-wheel drive, the engine's at the front, it produces 315 horsepower, it's quite light, does 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds, and then it's got a 6-speed sequential gearbox. It doesn't have a turbo, it's naturally aspirated, so it can bog down a little bit when going sideways, but you can still have plenty of fun on the loose surfaces, and it's just a much tamer version of the WRX class, and it's basically your perfect step from having no Rallycross experience at all before going to the full-blown supercars. So if you are new to Rallycross racing, I definitely recommend giving this car a go first before actually trying the full-blown WRX class, which is the last one that's featured in this game. And as you can see, there are a number of different cars that are actually available for this car class within the game. Now, these are your full Rallycross supercars. As you can see, they're producing 600 horsepower. They're 0 to 60 times at just over 2 seconds. They're pretty lightweight, very high top speed, 4-wheel drive, and these things are absolute monsters. You'll be shifting up and down gears rather rapidly. You'll be chucking these cars around left, right and centre through the corners and slamming down on the power, 4-wheel drifting around corners, and this is basically the top dogs of Rallycross racing, where the intensity is super high, the action is super close, and it's just a wall of noise and senses overload. These things are an absolute blast if you can tame them, but they are actually quite difficult to drive, which moves us very nicely onto the final section of this episode. And for this final part of the episode, we're actually going to take a look at the Rallycross driving and also hints and tips for Rallycross racing. Now, we're going to start off in the Ahlström Supercar Light car, and we're going to take a look at actually launching the car off the line. Now, depending on whether you're using the automatic clutch option or not will determine on how the best way to launch the car from the line. If you are using an automatic clutch and that's being handled for you, simply all you need to do is put your foot down, full throttle, and then shift up into gear as soon as the lights go green, and shift up and accelerate away. However, if you are using a manual clutch, you need to put your foot down on the clutch, engage first gear, hold the handbrake, and then release both the clutch and also the handbrake as soon as the lights go green, and away you go. Now, when it comes to driving the supercar cars, generally what I find is they prefer a more grip-based approach, and what I mean by that is by being smoother and trying to keep the slide angle as shallow as possible, especially on tarmac surfaces. Where the car doesn't have a turbo, it doesn't have the power and the torque of the Rallycross supercar cars. If the car does get into a slide and you're trying to power through it, the revs will tend to bog down a little bit, and it can make it a little bit more difficult to power through that slide and out the exit of the corner. So if you try and keep the car as smooth as it possibly can be and just drive the car through the corners in a more traditional racing sense, generally the car behaves a lot better. You accelerate out the corners a lot quicker as well. When it comes to the loose surface stuff with the supercar lights, you can get a little bit more slide angle on, but again you need to watch out for those revs bogging down. Obviously, where there's less grip on the loose surface, it's much easier for the tyres to actually spin up, but it's still possible if you do get too sideways for those revs to bog down, so you need to be careful of that. But even still, the Rallycross Supercar Light car is actually a really good stepping stone up towards the full-blown supercar cars. You can still have a lot of fun in them, you can still practice getting sideways and enjoying yourself, and they do provide some great Rallycross racing action. Now, when it comes to the actual full-blown Rallycross supercar cars, obviously where they've got the power from the turbo and they've got that torque, you can use that to really power on through a corner, power on through the slide and get some pretty aggressive four-wheel drifts and slide angles going. And obviously the revs don't really bog down all that much, especially on the loose surface where there's less traction. You can generally power on through that a lot easier. Now when it actually comes to cornering in these cars, there's a whole bunch of different techniques. It kind of depends on the type of corner and also your own personal preference and driving style. Obviously you've got the grip based technique that we talked about just now, where you brake in a more traditional sense. You tend to be a lot smoother, and you kind of manage the steering and you manage the throttle going through the corner and accelerating away, and obviously managing any oversteer on the exit. Another approach that you can use is you can use the handbrake to get the car rotated through the corner. Generally you tend to use it in much tighter corners in the hairpins or really tight chicanes. You may need to slow down the car a fair bit, quickly rip the handbrake to rotate the car around, and obviously counteract with the steering into the slide, and obviously manage the throttle out through the exit and power on through. And then some other techniques that you can use is by using the weight transfer of the car. So you can do that either by braking quite heavily, where obviously all the weight gets thrown towards the front and the rear tyres become light. If you do that whilst turning at the same time, you can rotate the rear end of the car that way, and then obviously manage to slide and power on through. Or you can use the lateral weight transfer by using the traditional rallying techniques such as the Scandinavian flick, where you quickly turn in the opposite direction to the corner that you're about to turn into, and then just as the weight is starting to transfer over, you quickly flip back into the turn again, and that will unsettle the car and put it into a nice progressive long slide doing it that way. And obviously you can use things such as the curbs, the changes in the surface of the track, and also bumps and things like that. Use those to flip the car around and get them rotated into corners and power on through. So there's a whole bunch of different techniques, and it kind of really depends on the actual type of corner as well. A more open sweeping corner may benefit from the Scandinavian flick and getting it in through that way, where you want to try and maintain the momentum and the power and the speed through the corner. Whereas for the tighter, twistier sections, you may want to actually get the car slowed down and then give a quick dab or rip with the handbrake to rotate the car through, and then using the power to accelerate out that way as well. It will also generally depends on how many cars are around you. Obviously, whilst a little bit of contact is allowed, if you go in too hot into a corner and use them as the brake, or you go in wanting to use the handbrake, it probably won't work if you've got that car in front of you, and you may incur a penalty. Now when it comes to the Joker lap, you'll need to serve it once every single Rallycross race. If you fail to take the Joker lap, or you take it more than once, you will incur a penalty. Now the Joker laps are actually marked with these massive great big gantries, and you'll also be able to see them on the track maps. They'll be marked there as well. But simply all you need to do is pass underneath this gantry, follow the Joker lap route through, and remain within track limits. Now there is some strategy when it actually comes to serving your Joker lap as well. Generally your race engineer will probably tell you the best time to actually take the Joker lap, but it depends on your actual race situation, and also actually depends on the type of Joker lap that it is. Generally most Joker laps tend to be actually longer than the main route of the track itself, but on some circuits the Joker lap can be shorter. The general rule of thumb for serving, especially the longer Joker laps, is to serve it when you've got a gap of 2 seconds to the car behind you. However, it may be beneficial to actually do it sooner, especially if you're stuck behind someone else and you feel that you can be faster than them. In this sort of situation, you obviously want to make sure that you serve your Joker lap before they do. You want to get yourself into clear air so you can put in the lap times that you need to make sure that you'll leapfrog that driver when they go ahead and serve their Joker lap. When it actually comes to the shorter routes, again it's all about picking your moment and doing it at the right time to make sure that you get ahead of your competitors. Where it's a shorter route, it's actually more about gaining track position. So if you're starting to lose touch and lose ground to the people in front of you, it may be beneficial to do your Joker lap sooner, as it's the shorter route. You'll be able to gain that track position back, and then hopefully be able to hold on to that position for the remainder of the race. Another important aspect of Rallycross is the tyres. Obviously with the change in surfaces and also the power of the cars, the tyres go through an awful lot of punishment. This means that the temperatures rise quite a lot, and also you'll burn through the tyres in terms of grip quite quickly as well. So whilst things will feel good at the start of the race and you'll feel confident in the car, it's got plenty of grip, you're able to maintain and manage a slide rather nicely, when it comes towards the end of the race, slides will increase a lot more. You'll have a lot less control over those slides, and you need to be a lot more careful and wary and probably approach corners slightly differently in that sense to make sure that you actually go through the corner without crashing or sliding into the barriers. So keep that in mind whilst racing in Rallycross, because obviously whilst massive great big four-wheel drifts look really cool, you're just going to put an awful lot of unnecessary heat through the tyres, take a huge chunk out of the tyre life and the tyre grip, and that will probably end up costing you towards the end of the race where the car's sliding around a lot more as well. Obviously making sure that you've got enough tyre life for the end of the race when you need to make that final attempt to try and push past someone, or you need it in trying to defend, will help in getting you better results in Rallycross racing. The last and final thing that I wanted to talk about in this episode is actually driving in snow and ice conditions. Now we're at the San Paulo ice circuit here, so we're going to be driving on ice and studded tyres, and I'm actually in the Polo Rallycross supercar, which obviously has an awful lot of power, and driving in these very slippery conditions, I'm going to have a lot less grip than I am driving on loose surfaces or tarmac of other Rallycross circuits. However, this place is a great training ground for learning how a car will react to your inputs in low grip situations and in slides. Now generally the best way to drive ice circuits and in these conditions and to be quick is to try and take the grip driving approach, where you'll be very smooth with the braking and also the throttle. Try not to get into too much of a slide, just balance the throttle through the corner, and then once you cut the car straight you can accelerate away. You can get a little bit of a slide angle going on through the corners, but you don't want too much, you want it to be relatively shallow. So here you've got a nice little bit of slip, and I'm basically just using the throttle more than anything to actually manage the slide. Now when it comes to actually using the throttle, if you get into a sideways slide like this one, if I just go heavy on the throttle here, it will just increase the corner radius, and you can see I'm just sliding out towards the outside of the circuit. However, if we come in, say into this corner, again get the slide going, yet use less of the throttle, the car decreases its sliding radius as it were, and will hug the inside of the corner a lot better. Now you don't want to lock up the wheels under braking, and generally you don't want to use the handbrake either, because that's just going to over rotate the car an awful lot. So it's all about being smooth with the brakes, using a little bit of steering input to get the car induced into a slide, and then just managing it by trying to keep the car as straight as possible and actually using your throttle input to manage the slide as well. So this is a really good training tool for learning how the car will respond to your inputs and learning how to be fast in low grip situations. So I definitely recommend trying out this ice surface racing, and obviously take what you learn from here over into the Rallycross races as well. But yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. Hopefully you guys found some useful hints and tips when it comes to Rallycross racing in Project Cars 2 in this episode. If you do have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. But other than that, thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel for more Insider's Guide episodes to the future, and also other videos which I'm hoping to pick up fairly soon as well. But other than that, thank you very much for watching guys. Hopefully I shall see you soon, but in the meantime, take care.